taught me this trick that usually works. Let's see if it works. Shh. Works? Works with children too, sometimes. Good evening, everyone. My name is Daniela Ligero, and I am the CEO of Together for Girls. And on behalf of our partners, SVRI, Together for Girls, and the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. Just so you're aware, the event is being live streamed, so in addition to all of you wonderful people sitting here, I think there are hopefully a lot more people watching us from around the world, so good night to all of you as well who are watching us. I just want to give you a sense of what the night's going to be like. I know it's late, you've had a long day, so we're trying not to keep you here long, and hopefully the food and the wine will help. First, we're going to hear some opening remarks, and then we're going to have two panels. And as the name suggests, the first panel will be focused on measuring progress, the name of the event. So we'll hear a little bit about where countries are at and what's the progress that we've made to date when it comes to ending sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse against children. And then the second panel will really focus on driving solutions, especially focused on prevention, thus the title. And so, without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce Douglas Griffiths. He is the president of the Oak Foundation, still under a year, so relatively new. I think you get to say that you're not new anymore after a year, so right now, right? Still relatively new. He has 30 years of experience advocating for human rights, for humanitarian relief, social development, and environmental protection. He also has a distinguished career as a diplomat, including serving as the U.S. ambassador to Mozambique. So it is a great honor to have you with us tonight. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Daniela. Good night, good evening, everyone. And the good news is I have no PowerPoint, and the better news is it's under 5 minutes. And I actually, I'm still going to draw on that being new thing, but I have the great honor of representing our stellar team from Oak that is at 2 tables. Why don't you all raise your hands? So if anyone has any questions on Oak Foundations and anything that would require a response of any substance, ask them, please. But Oak is a family foundation, and it's focused on addressing global, social, and environmental concerns. We're passionate in our pursuit of social justice, including contributing to a world where children can thrive. Preventing child sexual abuse is one of 7 major global problems our family has entrusted to our teams to work on. We do this through giving grants and getting behind partners like all of you. I'm here with our trustee, Caroline Turner, and members of our Prevent Child Sexual Abuse program. And Caroline recently very intentionally chose that title because it captures our impatience and our commitment. We believe that child sexual abuse can be prevented, and we believe that we can do it now. That boldness and clarity of vision reminds me of my introduction to work on gender-based violence. It was back in the early days of treatment for HIV/AIDS, and I was working in Haiti. And we had a vision of preventing mother-to-child transmission of AIDS. Unfortunately, the social and economic situation of Haiti collapsed, and we were unable, because of violence, to do a lot of work. However, incredibly courageous and committed health workers, community workers, and frontline workers came together and achieved what many thought was impossible, and in that very turbulent time, prevented the spread of mother-to-child transmission of AIDS and really made progress on a number of gender-related violence issues. That experience taught me that working together with boldness, ambition, and a focus on people at risk, we can do this. This is why I'm so excited to join Caroline and our team who share this vision. We can prevent child sexual abuse. The goals of SVRI are build evidence, strengthen capacity, promote partnership, and influence change. This aligns perfectly with our approach. We've learned a lot over the past 20 years, including the importance of shifting our mandate from one primarily focused on response to one almost exclusively focused on prevention. Why? Because of the numbers. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 7 boys have experienced child sexual abuse. The sad truth is that we either are or we know someone who is a survivor. This is a global pandemic affecting girls and boys in all countries of the world. Inspire and Together for Girls' new resource, What Works to Prevent Violence Against Children, What Works to Prevent Sexual Violence Against Children, show us what governments and communities need to do to end the epidemic. They serve as an inventory of hope and a proof of concept that we can live in a world free from sexual violence. I look forward to learning more tonight. But before we turn to that part of the evening, I'd like to share 3 short examples of some of the things our partners are doing. In Nairobi, rapes have dropped more than 50% in communities where girls and boys take part in a powerful new training program called No Means No. In northern Uganda, through Real Fathers Initiative, after being mentored by trained peers, young fathers were half as likely to use physical, psychological, and verbal violence with their wives and children. But of course, these solutions are not enough. Ending child sexual abuse requires political will. Regrettably, this has been a neglected and ignored issue, and will remain so if governments do not prioritize action. In the wake of the Me Too movement and recent courageous reporting of sexual abuse, we know that change requires pressure and public outrage. The Out of the Shadows Index, benchmarking how 60 countries around the world are responding to child sexual abuse, is a new advocacy tool that can be used to hold governments accountable for their commitments to ending child sexual abuse, including under the SDGs. This is the first index of its kind and has the potential significant driver of change if civil society and governments come together and demand that change. The trio of tools provide us with a roadmap that will help us bring visibility to a silent issue. They point us to solutions at the policy and the programmatic level. 1, we need to continue to build evidence to develop a more nuanced understanding of what works, for whom, and under what circumstances. 2, we need to learn to adapt and scale the evidence that we have. And 3, we need to pressure governments to take action. I also hope that we reaffirm our support to survivors, that we amplify their voices, listen to their wisdom, and fight for remedy and healing. At the Oak Foundation's board meeting last week, the Prevent Child Sexual Abuse team invited a survivor of online abuse to share her story. This is a particularly pernicious form of child sexual abuse that recurs online, trapping survivors in an endless cycle of horrors. Our guest, who used the pseudonym Nicole, was an inspiration. With her ferocious courage, Nicole challenged us to double down on our commitments to hold tech companies responsible. Like Nicole's, the tools presented today will give us a clear path forward. There's no excuse for inaction. We have solutions, we can prevent child sexual abuse, and the time is now. Thank you all for your participation and for your commitment to bringing these solutions to scale and to create a safer world for boys and girls. Thank you very much.
I don't think it's on. Hello, is this on? Oh, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Hope you're enjoying your dinner. My name is Chichi Undia. I'm a senior associate with the Population Council in Nairobi, and I have the pleasure this evening of interviewing 2 experts on the Out of the Shadows Index. So I'd like to invite them both up, and then I will introduce them, and we'll have a seat right here. So we have Catherine Stewart, who is a public policy consultant with the Economic Intelligence Unit. I hope I got that right. And Lydia Wasula, who is the national coordinator of the Orphans and Vulnerable Children Unit at the Uganda Ministry of Labor and Social Development. And you're both very welcome. And I'm going to do some back and forth questions with you both on this panel entitled the Out of the Shadows Index. And I would like to start with you, Catherine, perhaps by having you tell us exactly what this Out of the Shadows Index is, for those of us who aren't aware. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Doug. You've actually teed up and done my job for me. For those of you who don't know, the Economist Intelligence Unit is the research arm of the Economist Group, best known for publishing The Economist magazine. And our public policy team works with all types of organizations, including the Oak Foundation, to drive progress on policy issues. So the Out of the Shadows Index is a benchmarking tool that looks at 60 countries around the world and tracks how those countries are responding to the scourge of child sexual abuse and exploitation across 4 pillars. So we look at the environment in which such abuse happens and what can be done to prevent that. So these include everything from educating students, parents, children, to understanding gender and cultural norms that might exacerbate risks, to looking at political violence. We look at the legal systems in countries to understand how laws prevent child sexual abuse. And then we look at the implementation of those laws, so what structures are in place that allow governments specifically to respond. Finally, we also look at the role of the private sector, civil society, and the media in building out responses to this issue. So that's kind of a summary. And our goal through this country level exercise is to highlight the gaps in country systems to help think about how we can develop solutions.
So maybe you've answered my next question a little bit, but you might want to add on to that. I was going to ask, what do you see from a global perspective? What do you see as the value of such an index?
So I think there's a few things that are really important. One is just creating a benchmark, a benchline of what exactly are the challenges that countries across the globe face. And we look at countries from the United Kingdom to Mozambique to understand what those problems are. And the second is to start to map out what is the path for all stakeholders to end child sexual abuse and exploitation. So what are steps that everyone can take, and how do you start doing that? And then finally, the SDGs have put this issue on the policy agenda. And one of the big goals we all have is, how do we track progress that's being made? And so our hope is that as we continue to update this index in countries, we'll be able to see those changes and to track where progress is being made, where we are not making progress, and where we need to prioritize efforts.
Okay, thank you. And since you've mentioned the word benchmark, I'm going to turn to Lydia now, and then I'll come back to you. But Lydia, I just wanted to ask, from your perspective, working in Uganda, why is it important to have benchmarking tools when we think about driving programs around violence?
Okay, thank you. Good evening, members. I think the problem of violence against children is everywhere. So just regardless of the economic status of the country, regardless of what a country is, it cuts across board. So benchmarking is important for us to learn from each other. How does the other government do it? How does the other country do it? What are those best practices that we can pick on? What is the level of progress in the other country? Where are we? For instance, in my case, Uganda, I can be able to tell where my position as a country, where am I in terms of violence when I compare myself with other countries. I think to cut the long story short, it helps us to learn the best practices, what works, what practically works to end violence against children from other countries.
Thank you. And this particular index, called Out of the Shadows, Lydia, it measures countries on a variety of factors, including whether or not they have undertaken a violence against children survey, VAX for short. So can you tell us what drove Uganda to undertake their own VAX survey, and what were some of the key findings?
Okay. Like I've said before, that violence against children cuts across the globe. So the story is no different from Uganda. There is a lot of violence, as we all know it, but we lacked this evidence-based programming. We had put a lot of interventions in place, but which were not being informed by scientific evidence. So we had to conduct the Violence Against Children survey, which is the first ever Violence Against Children survey we have conducted in Uganda. So right now, it works as a baseline for all the other surveys We are using that data as a baseline. And the findings actually revealed even more violence than we even thought or we even anticipated. For instance, the study revealed that 35% of Ugandan girls are sexually abused and 17% of the boys. And 59% of the girls and 68% of the boys are physically abused. And 34 to 35% of the boys and girls are emotionally abused in Uganda. So that's what the findings revealed. But before that, we just used to talk about violence and just putting interventions in place without this scientific evidence. So we're not doing evidence-based programming. So when we did undertake the VAC survey, at least now we have a baseline to base on when we are programming and doing all the policy decisions in terms of violence against children.
Thank you. And lastly, Lydia, before I come back to you, Catherine, so what is Uganda doing now to prioritize violence prevention and response, given that it has this evidence base?
Okay, ever since the survey, and we did a report which we launched last year in August, and the report puts across several recommendations. Right now we are into the implementation phase already. We are trying to implement the recommendations, and the recommendations are no different from the Inspire package. It's all about the Inspire, if we can implement the Inspire and also coordinate better and conduct more accompanying surveys to support the baseline survey of the violence against children. But also, we have the Uganda Child Helpline 116 Sauti, which is a government-managed child helpline that works on both prevention and response. And apparently, we receive over 750 calls per day. And the calls range from children are calling in, the guardians are calling in, the caretakers are calling in. So many people, but there is more from the children calling in. The Violence Against Children survey report has also been used to develop the first ever child policy. We have never had any policy to do with children in Uganda. What we had was only the Orphans and Other Vulnerable Children policy, which has been in place since 2004. And according to our country, after 10 years, we are supposed to review and probably come up with a new policy or improve on the existing policies. So right now, after conducting the Violence Against Children survey, we are using the report to inform the first ever child policy for Uganda and its accompanying national action plan. So all the report recommendations, because we wanted to avoid a situation where we would have a national action plan running on its own, then a national action plan for the child policy. So we have integrated everything in the national action plan for the child policy, all the report recommendations for the Violence Against Children report. But we have also started on the implementation of the Inspire. We are implementing the coaching boys into men. We have piloted it already and we have seen results in one district in Uganda, the coaching boys into men and the cognitive behavioral therapy with support from WHO World Vision and TPO Uganda. We are also implementing the SASA model, but we are also implementing the no means no in 6 districts of Uganda, including the capital itself. So we are doing a lot of things around that. And we have a program running on online violence, ending online violence, because as we understand and appreciate, there is a lot of violence taking place online. Children are using their phones, they are using all those gadgets around them to do, and people are taking advantage of the situation too. So there is a lot of online violence, but we are already working on that, and a lot of other things.
Well, that's really exciting to hear all the things going on in Uganda in response to the survey that you carried out. I would like to ask you, Catherine, to kind of close us out by perhaps sharing any particular successes or challenges as well that, from a global standpoint when it comes to using the Out of the Shadows Index.
I think it's interesting that you asked that because I think Lydia has highlighted one of our biggest challenges that some countries who have taken on the vax have started to conquer. When we started this whole initiative, we intended to track the prevalence of sexual violence against children in countries around the world. And it became very clear to us, thanks to many of the people sitting in this room, that that was not going to be feasible on any scaled level. So the data that exists on the prevalence of this issue is so sparse, and it's only through tools like the VAX surveys that we are able to understand what's going on in countries. And so one of the big kind of pushes and calls to action that I leave everyone with today is thinking about how do we actually wrap our heads around the scale of sexual violence against children as part of this bigger attempt to not only respond to the issue, but also to prevent it. And so the work that we're doing is a first step. It is kind of the high level, what can we do next through this index? How do we prioritize our resources? But I think universally that is the challenge we see in countries and the challenge that we encourage you to think of.
Thank you. And on that note, we're going to end this first panel. Wish we had more time, but a round of applause, please, for our two interviewees. Thank you.
All right. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Kati Maternowska, who is the lead. Oh, I have that written down here, Kati, because Kati and I talk
Shall I introduce
pretty much
myself?
every day. See if I get this right. Lead on data, evidence, and learning at the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. And what we figured is that we would interview each other to make it a little interesting. So I'm going to ask Kati some questions, and then she'll interview me. So, Kati, we've heard already about Inspire today. So why don't you tell us, for those of you who don't know, what is Inspire and why is Inspire so important for the field of violence prevention?
Thanks, Daniela. So Inspire is 7 evidence-based strategies. And when I say that to prevent violence against children, it's really important that people understand that that is a gigantic thing for our field. Inspire is about 40 years of cumulative research that's ended up in a technical package for practitioners and policymakers all over the world. It is the implementation of laws and science and laws and policies for I. It's the safe spaces for the S, norms and values, parenting, income generation, response and services, and education. So it spells out Inspire. And it's a really important package because it has so many years of research behind it and it's evidence-based. It's also important because unlike most pieces of toolkits and guidelines that are available to people in the world, this has 10 international agencies that have backed it. And that doesn't happen often, so that really makes it very well endorsed. And finally, I think the most important thing about Inspire is that it really galvanizes people who need to tackle violence. And it's brought the entire community together. I mean, even here at SVRI, we've got humanitarian experts, we've got, regular development experts, policymakers, donors. We're all galvanized around one thing, and that's really, really important. It's 3 pieces. It's evidence, it's an implementation handbook, and it's indicators. So together as a technical package, it really does bring people centered around a series and a set of strategies.
Fantastic. And you spend a lot of time in what are known as pathfinding countries as part of the global partnership, Uganda, of course, being one of them. Can you tell us a little bit about how Inspire has kind of resonated in the field? It was fantastic to hear Lydia talking about it, but tell us a little bit more about how it's landed in the field, how it's being used.
Right, so trying to tackle violence against children is an absolutely overwhelming task for most policymakers and practitioners in the field. There's sexual violence, there's emotional violence, there's physical violence. It's happening in homes, in communities, in schools, and online, as Lydia pointed out. It's happening everywhere, and it's very hard for people in the field, governments and practitioners, to actually focus in and figure out where to enter, and where to begin, and where to start, and how to start. So in that sense, Inspire is almost an antidote to this overwhelming feeling of where do I go, where do I start, how do I begin? Because we give them a package that they have. So that's the most important thing, I think, that resonates in the field, is that people feel a sense of relief. Now, when they open up Inspire and see that it is quite detailed in all of its evidence, implementation, and indicators, they need to work on it, and that's what we work on through the partnership and our partners in the field. Another thing that resonates in the field is that when people receive this package, they feel, oh, violence is preventable, because it's never a priority in government. So for the first time ever, they think there is a possibility that we can end this in my country, and I think that's a huge, huge important thing. Two anecdotal things about how it resonates. The first is that a few days ago, I received a WhatsApp from one of our pathfinding cities in the Philippines. And my colleague from the Department of Social Welfare had pictures on the WhatsApp, and she said, "Is this it?" And I looked, and it was the Inspire manual that she had downloaded from WHO. And I said, "That's it." And she said, "I'm going to start reading it." And she reported to me 2 days later that she had read the entire thing from cover to cover, which is really a task. And it's pretty impressive that a department head of social welfare in a city is actually taking that and feeling ownership over it. A related story is that a few months earlier, the First Lady of Colombia, which is one of our newer pathfinding countries, had written to us and said, "I need 33 copies of Inspire." And this is a huge technical package. So we said, okay. And we asked, what will you be doing with these 33 copies? And she said, "I am sending one to every department/state in my country. There are 32 states, and I'm leaving one for myself." And she said, "Send them as soon as you can." So what's great about that story is that you've got the political person and the practical person, and you can't separate politics from practice with violence against children, and it's happening because of Inspire.
That's awesome. So based on your work today, what do you think the bigger challenges are ahead in terms of implementing Inspire, scaling Inspire? What are those barriers moving forward?
Right, so I think the biggest challenge is that we still have violence. And in fact, I would guess I've been speaking about 7 minutes. During that period, one child somewhere in the world has died from a violence-related act. And that is not even accounting for all the children who are suffering and not dying from violence-related acts. To put it in better perspective, the figure we use often, but we really need to think about, is that 1 billion children are affected by violence annually, which is really an outstanding number that we toss around in our field, but when you think about it, 1 billion children, that's so high and so outrageous. So I think that's our biggest challenge, that we still have children who are being violated. Inspire is a tool to address this problem. And Inspire, as it stands now, is first edition. And we know that first editions always need second and third editions, and I suspect that we will have them in the future with more evidence and more information. The key challenge is that when people like Dorothy in the city of Valenzuela or other practitioners or academics receive this package, this technical package, it's overwhelming because the evidence is based on research. And translating research into real programs in very complex environments of a city in Philippines or of a rural and remote village in South Africa, also unique and also complex, is a difficulty. So we really need to work more with our practitioners, train them up to use the manual, to be able to have the skills, work with local universities, and work with all of our stakeholders, meaning government, our UN agencies, our academics, our children at the center of it all, and really work to build a more stakeholder-friendly type of Inspire. So, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kati. That was great. Should we switch roles?
We'll switch. So Daniela, I do remember what she does, is the head of Together for Girls, which works very closely with the CDC and the VAX surveys that we referred to earlier. And Daniela also sits on our executive committee of the Global Partnership to End Violence, so she's playing many multiple roles to end violence against children. And I'll start my questions. So for the past year, Together for Girls has worked with partners to develop what works to prevent sexual violence against children. How does this evidence review build off the Inspire strategies? And what does it show?
Yeah, thanks, Kati. So I think I'll split up my answer into two parts. Let me give a little bit of context for the resource that we're launching tonight, and you have copies on your table in case you're curious. And then in the second part, I'll talk a little bit about what we found. So first of all, for context, the idea here was to use the INSPIRE framework that you've just described so eloquently to actually go deeper into one particular form of violence, and that is sexual violence. And the focus, of course, being on prevention. So what do we know? What is the global evidence? And the word global is important because we really wanted to make sure that we were looking across countries, across development to understand what does work to prevent this particular form of violence. And a few notes I want to make. The first is that, you know, we understand that sexual violence against children doesn't happen in isolation. There's often multiple forms of violence that happen with sexual violence. There's polyvictimization. It's really important to understand that broader context. But we also believe that there is value in going deeper in one particular form of violence to understand the specificities there, and if there are interventions that are specific to that form of violence that can actually make a difference. The second thing that I think was really important for us as we were doing this evidence review is we really wanted to bring a gender and an age lens to the work. We talk a lot about integrating gender into ending violence against children and a life course approach. The reality is we don't really see a lot of that happening. So we tried really hard to say, okay, what works for girls, what works for boys, what works for both, as well as are there interventions that work in early childhood, and is that different from the kinds of interventions that are going to work during early adolescence or late adolescence. So throughout the evidence review, we really tried to do that. And I think the other important thing was we tried to look at sexual violence broadly. So there's, we categorize, for example, child sexual abuse in here and looked at those interventions. But we also looked at things like online violence, sexual violence. We looked at sexual violence within the context of dating relationships, child marriage. So multiple forms of sexual violence as part of the review. And the idea here is that we wanted to put everything in one place, like INSPIRE, building off of that for practitioners, for advocates, for decision makers, something that was easy to understand and to digest. And I think for me, this has been a labor of love over the last year, and I want to just say special thanks to everyone that worked on this particular resource. Special thanks to the Oak Foundation for supporting us, for the Equality Institute, and for many, many of the people that reviewed the resource, including you and several of the people that are in this room today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But one of the things that was really striking for me was that that there's a lot that's categorized as either effective or promising. There are interventions that we know work. Doug, you mentioned a few of them already, things like empowerment and self-defense, things like working with men and boys, things like whole-of-school approaches that target teachers, that target students, parenting programs, and also parenting programs that try to prevent dating violence and sexual violence within dating relationships. There's a lot out there that's either effective or promising, and I think that was really encouraging. The other thing that I think was really interesting is we tried to also categorize interventions as prudent. In other words, there might be things that are important that maybe don't have a randomized controlled trial behind them, but it's important to value different forms of knowledge. And so, for example, around implementation and enforcement of laws, we know that if you eliminate or extend statutes of limitation in terms of how soon after child sexual abuse occurs you can put forward your case, if you do that, more people come forward. And more people are thus tried. We know, for example, that having a strong child protection system at the national level is absolutely critical to do prevention. And so we really tried to also bring that out in this report, in addition to just what the more traditional forms of evidence are. At the end of the day, there's a lot that works, and we need to invest more in what works.
Right, and accelerate that implementation in the field. So important. So what do you think is the biggest challenge to scaling up some of these solutions, like moving them beyond one intervention into something much bigger, nationwide, et cetera? And what gives you hope Because that's a tough one. We know from working in the field, it's tough to scale up.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think the challenges are so similar to the challenges really for scaling up and doing more around preventing violence against children and violence against women at large. They're not specific to the issue of sexual violence, I don't think. And for me, you know, I've been working on this stuff for 20 years. So many of us have been doing this work for so long. You know, I feel like for a long time, as a field, we've invested in kind of showing the magnitude of the problem. This is how big the problem is. These are the studies that show prevalence. It's an issue. We're trying to raise awareness around that. And I think one of the pivots that's already happening, and I've already heard it a lot at this conference, is this idea of moving beyond that to it doesn't have to be this way. It's bad, but it doesn't have to be this way. There are things we can do to prevent violence from happening. And so it's really shifting that narrative. Unfortunately, I think that if you look at the general public or decision makers, there's still a lot of pessimism and not a lot of hope and knowledge around the fact that it doesn't have to be this way. So I think that's important. I also think it's important to acknowledge that when we talk about violence against children and violence against women, we're talking about inequality. And that's the inequality that exists between adults and children, and also gender inequality. And changing the status quo is tough, and there's backlash, and it's difficult. So I think this idea of advocating, pushing, you know, investing in civil society, really kind of joining movements and making sure that governments, institutions, organizations are investing resources in this space and are really, you know, politicians are putting political will and resources behind this is really critical, and we have to continue to push on this because today the reality is, I mean, we're talking about prevention and we're seeing improvements. The amount of money, time, and energy that goes to violence prevention against children and women is ridiculous compared to the magnitude of the problem. So there's still a lot to do. But what gives me hope is that we know now what works, and so we need to continue to pull our movements together to do more.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so I'm looking across the audience at all these people here. I don't know everybody, but I know a lot of people. I see academics, I see some policymakers, I see UN people, I see donors, I see government, Lydia's government, I'm sure there's other government people here. There's a whole mix of people. What can people in this room do to help us? I think we're speaking to the converted in this crowd. But nonetheless, what's the message that we want to give out for people to help us end sexual violence and end violence altogether for children?
Well, I'm going to focus a little on sexual violence against children for that one, Kati. I think one of the important things to understand is that everyone has a role to play when it comes to ending sexual violence against children. And I want to start by thanking you for all that you do already. I mean, this is a unique group of people who are committed to this issue. But I do believe there's a lot more that we can do around breaking the silence around this issue. And I'll say a little bit about my own experience. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. My abuse started at the age of 6, and I spent many years living alone and in silence with this issue. And it was a tough existence. And I've been telling my story publicly for a while now because I'm one of the few children, you know, you read the statistics at the beginning, Doug, I'm one of those statistics, but I'm also one of the few that eventually had access to services, to resources, to mental health, and it helped me heal, and I've been on this amazing journey now for 30 years, and it's brought me here to you today. But I really believe that part of what we need to do is break the silence. And I started telling my story because the silence was deafening. It was deafening. And when I say break the silence, I want to be really clear. I'm not talking about survivors. I'm talking about families. I'm talking about communities, governments, institutions. We all have a role in breaking the silence. And that means, you know, making sure that we're having some of these tough, difficult conversations. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of my idols. She's an American First Lady, and she was really instrumental in starting the UN. She talked about the fact that human rights need to start in the small places close to home. So small and so close to home that you can't see them on a map. And so, you know, I think, of course, we need to make sure that governments and institutions are spending more money and doing more on this, but I also think we all have a responsibility. And so, you know, if you're close to a child, whether it's as a parent, whether it's as an educator, whether it's as a mentor, and you haven't had a conversation about child sexual abuse with that child, of course it has to be developmentally appropriate, but if you haven't, that's a problem. If you haven't asked the school where that child studies or the sports team that that child belongs to, what are their policies around safeguarding? What are their policies around reporting abuse? That's a problem. And so, you know, I think, yes, absolutely, you know, you need to think big, but you also need to think small. And I think we all have a role in terms of pushing this agenda forward. And, you know, I think I want to encourage you, I want to end on a positive note. I think if we do more of that, we will break the silence and we will really be able to advance this agenda in new ways. So I want to encourage you to look at the Out of the Shadows Index, which is amazing and really gives you a sense of where countries are at. I want to encourage you to take a look at the new report we've launched. This is just the executive summary. There's 100 pages online that you can really dive deep into. There are interviews, there's all kinds of fun things on the website. But I also want to encourage you to think about those small places because we can all do more to be better protectors of children. And finally, I want to thank you, and I think I'll close with that, if that's okay, because I know we want to wrap up. And I want to close, since we're in South Africa, I want to close with a quote from Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done. And you all, my friends, I'm getting emotional. All of you in this room here and at this conference are making the impossible possible. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I hope that you have a wonderful end of the conference. Thank you for being here. Enjoy a glass of wine and more dinner if you haven't. Thank you.